Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ISDP webinar on India, South Korea, and Quad Plus Calculus in Indo-Pacific. Myself, Jagannath Panda, I am heading the Indo-Pacific Center in ISDP. And today's webinar is actually in collaboration with the Korea Foundation program we are running here. And it's a part of the research project we are doing on India, South Korea, connecting Indo-Pacific minilateralism to multilateralism. And we are having today a fantastic set of scholars and experts who have actually worked not only on the Korean issues, but also on the broader Indo-Pacific regions. And let me introduce each one of them very briefly before we start the webinar today. So we have a terrific panel. First, let me introduce you Professor Chungon An. He has been a terrific scholar on India-Korea relationship for more than 3 to 4 decades. In fact, I have been immensely benefited reading his write-ups from my students' time. And he has been a leading figure in terms of promoting not only Korea's economic diplomacy in various capacity with the Korean government, but also been a champion scholar on India-Korea relationship particularly, and how that can be advanced. He has written a lot, and I would strongly recommend anyone who is following on India-Korea and Indo-Pacific, they should read Professor An's writings. He is currently a distinguished professor at the Graduate School of International Studies in Chungang University in Seoul. He has been a president with the KIEP, and he has also held the co-chair of the Korea-India Strategic Dialogue. And his profile is there in the website. You could see his rich profile. So we would be taking the advantage in terms of knowing from him how he thinks, mostly from the economic and strategic point of view, how Korea is thinking to engage with India, both within the Quad Plus format and outside the Quad Plus format. Then we have one Indian scholar joining from Delhi, Dr. Pooja Bhatt. She's actually the author of the book, 9-Line, Deciphering in the South China Sea Conundrum. And Pooja has been actually in the subject in the strategic studies nearly for a decade now. And she has been with the Ministry of External Affairs in India, and she has also finished her PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and very active in terms of writing and speaking in the strategic circuit. Recently, she actually co-authored a terrific policy brief with Dr. Brendan Cannon, who is another panelist here in our webinar on Quad and submarine cables. And I strongly recommend to read that policy brief and probably download it from our ISDP's website. The other 3 panelists are actually associated research fellows with ISDP. We have Dr. Brendan Cannon. Currently, he's a faculty with the International Security at the Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi. He actually earned his PhD from University of Utah and been terrific in writings on Quad and Indo-Pacific narratives. His edited book with Routledge, which is published a couple of years back with Professor Kei Hakata, has been really well received, and I was fortunate to have a chapter there. Welcome, Dr. Cannon. Then we have Mahima, our own ISDP associated fellow, who is also very active in the Indo-Pacific circuit in terms of writing not only about Indian foreign policy, but also on the Indo-Pacific power politics. Currently, she is a doctoral fellow at the GIGA in Germany in Hamburg, and she is associated with ISDP and writing very frequently here and there. And I strongly recommend to read her writings on Indian foreign policy and Indo-Pacific narratives. We have also, last but not least, our in-house associated fellow expert, Professor Stephen Nagy. Stephen is a professor at the International Christian University in Japan, and he actually received his PhD from Waseda University in 2008. And he holds many hats here and there. He's associated with Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He's also associated with Japan Institute of International Affairs. And also he has a hat with the YCAPS, Yokosuka Council of Asia Pacific, where he's the Director of Policy Studies. And I've been very fortunate to collaborate with Stephen over the number of years on many writings together and speaking in many forums. Welcome to you, Stephen. So without really taking much time, let me welcome all of you and all of our participants and listeners who have joined not only here, but also in the social media platforms. Welcome all of you, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are based in. And we will keep this webinar nearly for 1.5 hours. And keeping the time in mind, in the interest of the time, I would request each of the panelists to share their initial thoughts. We had shared the concept note, which is there in the ISDP website with the broader questions. But let me give all of you a couple of minutes introduction before posing some of these questions to Professor An. Then I'll be switching to Pooja, then Brendan, and then Mahima, and then Stephen. So Professor An, I'll start with you. As you know, we have been talking about Indo-Pacific narrative, and Korea is having a much more focused Indo-Pacific strategy under the Yoon administration. And there is a lot of new issues are emerging in India-Korea relationship at this moment. You have been writing a lot about India-Korea relationship. And today's webinar is actually to understand whether there is realistically a chance between India and Korea to collaborate within that Quad extended format, which is a Quad Plus format. And if there is any, then what are the areas we should shortlist to talk about this? And I would remind for our listeners here and participants here that we know that the Quad started almost 2 decades back when there was tsunami, and then 2007 when the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came to India and delivered a flagship speech in Indian Parliament about the Quad process, and then it really fizzled out. And in 2017, again, the whole process started as a Quad 2.0 with the ministerial meeting happening. And in 2021, September 24th, for the first time, we had a Quad leadership summit happen. And in that leadership summit, if we read that joint statement which has come, official outlet which has come, there is a mention about that it's time to collaborate with the like-minded partners. Now, during the pandemic also, what we saw, interestingly, that the Quad countries also invited few, they thought like-minded countries to discuss about issues of mutual concern. They invited New Zealand, they invited South Korea, they invited Vietnam. Also, at some stage, Israel was also invited. So since that time, there is a strategic and public narrative is emerging about Quad Plus, and I think both Stephen and Brendan has collaborated with me on a Quad Plus project earlier, and we have been writing about the Quad Plus, including Mahima. And I think this is where we need to understand that is there really a formal Quad Plus mechanism possible in times to come? Can we really build it? Even though there is no official mention about Quad Plus as a format, but we know that the Quad countries have engaged with these so-called like-minded partners, they think, involving the Quad process. So that would be my one of my questions to each of the panelists. And then I would also request each of the panelists to comment on about whether if we have to assume that there is a Quad Plus format can be formalized at some stage, then what are the key areas where the Quad Plus countries can collaborate, and where does India and Korea can really build their partnership, both bilaterally and also in the Indo-Pacific undercurrents, factoring the Quad Plus format. So I'll start with you, Professor An. Maybe you could share your views for 7 to 8 minutes or maximum 10 minutes, and then we'll come to Pooja, then Brendan, then Mahima, and then Stephen. Over to you, Professor An.
Thank you very much, Jagan. Good morning or good afternoon to everybody. Koreans, they celebrate Lunar New Year now, just 3 days away, far bigger fashion than the solar calendar New Year. So happy, Lunar New Year to you all. Well, today I would like to talk about the strategic promotion of bilateral FDI between India and South Korea in the ROC's Indo-Pacific prism. First, in a bilateral context, and then unilateral regionalism frame. As an economist, I believe both trade and investment linkage between India and South Korea explain persuasively the characteristics of bilateral relations. Later on, maybe I'll extend this relationship in the context of the Quad, as Jagan just mentioned. I would like to explore the strategic promotion of the bilateral foreign direct investment connectivity between South Korea and India using an extended gravity model to enhance the strategic partnership between two countries established in 2015. The gravity model treats economic size, measured normally in GDP, and geographical distance as major explanatory variables to characterize cross-border trade and FDI flows. But here, I want to bring in two additional variables, namely psychological distance, as well as a security connectedness, as Jaga mentioned, how Korea is related to the Quad framework. India is now geared to great industrial transformation for manufacturing hub in Indo-Pacific for India's sustainable high growth to reach the third biggest economy within this decade under India's flagship economic policy, Make in India, now self-reliant India under Prime Minister Modi's South Korea Yoon Suk-yeol government Indo-Pacific strategy is also searching for a supply chain resilience toward South Korea's world-class high-tech economy in the years to come and meaningful economic outreach into the global South. So here we can see that a strategic convergence of national goals, both India and South Korea, recognizing each other a key strategic, like-minded partner in the intensifying geo-economic fragmentation. However, in reality, despite the ROC-India CEPA effectuation from 2010 onward, ROC-India trade and FDI volume have not increased significantly comparable to their economic profiles, far lower than those with Vietnam or even Indonesia. The difference becomes even bigger when we compare ROC's connectivity with ASEAN as a whole, with India. Perhaps the geographical distance and the psychological difference might explain the difference between ROC and the Indian relationship vis-a-vis ROC and Vietnam, or ROC vis-a-vis the ASEAN as a whole. On the India's inward foreign direct investment front, ROC's presence is also very marginal compared with other peers like Netherlands and Japan. Despite early pioneering of ROC's multinationals like the Hyundai, Samsung, and LG, ROC shared only 0.86% of India's total cumulative inbound FDI by the end of the 2022, whereas Japan took a much larger share, amounting to 6.2%. As a result, one argues that India-ROC relations are still very perplexing, given a very slow progress in many economic and security contexts. In case of Japan, its outbound FDI to India in recent years has been rapidly on the rise, fueled by Japan-India security partnership expanded in the Quad membership. Japan and India had committed to build a Japan's Shinkansen-type railway to connect Mumbai and Ahmedabad, which symbolized the flagship project of Japan-India economic relations. So given India's positive shift of FDI inducement policy recently and ROC's diversification strategies from excessive trade and investment dependence on China, it is now a golden opportunity for ROC and India to enhance economic and security partnership to a highest potential confidence level. In response to India's concern on its sustained trade deficit against ROC, Seoul leads to augment strategically its large-scale FDI commitment into India to achieve expanded economic equilibrium. On a bilateral context first, let me suggest the following key areas for ROC's strategic outbound foreign direct investment to India. First, India has a significant infrastructure deficit in areas like logistics, transportation, electricity, etc., especially inland and ocean logistics are still very poorly developed. In this regard, ROC is highly desired to commit a very large-scale SOC project, including modern city development project, port city development, or a large-scale even nuclear power plant into India, with a flexible increase of official development assistance resources, symbolizing ROC in their flagship collaboration, similar to Japan's express railway investment. Second, arms collaboration is very effective for both confidence building and high-tech trade and foreign direct investment. ROC has already made a good footprint for the joint venture for the arms production, as seen in the case of K9 self-artillery. India continues to increase its defense budget and to reduce excessive dependence on the Russian arms. Under these circumstances, India and ROC can become a valuable strategic partner for arms collaboration, which helps enhance mutual trust and naturally leading to expanded trade and foreign direct investment. Third, ROC should showcase a large-scale high-tech foreign direct investment into India. In particular, semiconductor industry deserves special attention. In the medium term, ROC's semiconductor investment in China needs to exit gradually if the current sanctions imposed on high-end semiconductors by the United States persist under its security guardrails. ROC should invest a very scale of semiconductor manufacturing in India after Vietnam, Indonesia as next China. For this purpose, ROC should take a good lessons from Micron's investment approach under such a lucrative schemes provided the Indian central and local government. Now, let me move on the ROC-India collaboration, the unilateral and the regional context. First, I think ROC need to develop ROC ASEAN-India triangular industrial cooperation corridor. Both ROC and India have built strategic partnership with the resource-rich and vibrant ASEAN economies. India has also developed a very close relationship with ASEAN, as evident in Prime Minister Modi's 12-point proposal with ASEAN September last year. A similar triangular partnership could be extended to other key economies in the Indo-Pacific. ROC's FTA commitment to India will allow trilateral cooperation mechanism of ROC, Japan, India link after ROC and Japan has bottomed out from the diplomatic worst. ROC, Australia, India triangular collaboration is another candidate because India, Japan, Australia are all key members of the Quad. Second, ROC should join Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, which was formed in April 2021 by India, Australia, and Japan, three core members of the Quad, to reduce reliance on China and create a sustainable, balanced supply chain. ROC has now shared interest with all three members of the Quad as a reliable partner, and Korea has a competitive industrial base conducive to objective the supply chain resilience initiative to fruition. ROC's membership to supply chain resilience initiative will help ROC's outbound FDI to India. Third, ROC should active in Quad working group activities, as already ROC has participated in the working group this seminar. India and ROC share strongly strategic interest in safeguarding freedom of navigation and the maritime public goods in Indo-Pacific. ROC's Indo-Pacific Manifesto was conceived on a highly open, trade, and peaceful regional order. In particular, maritime cooperation between two countries have become strategic for their likely expanding defensive ties, covering maritime domain, awareness, shipbuilding, humanitarian, disaster relief operation, and counter-terrorism in Indo-Pacific. Fourth, while staying within the U.S.-anchored like-minded security domain, ROC and India needs to pursue a strategic autonomy by making middle power coalition to ensure a rules-based inclusive regional order by raising voices against big powers' unilateral protectionist policies as shown by the U.S. security guardrails and the Inflation Reduction Act, exclusively designed for the U.S. interests at the expense of smaller and less powerful allies. If Donald Trump is elected again, the situation is likely to getting worse. To do this, ROC should actively outreach Global South to pursue a rules-based, inclusive liberal system and sharing its development experiences as a soft power with increased ODA assistance resources. Over the past years, India has established a multi-alignment diplomacy with a lot of these economies in Global South, and India can help South Korea outreach Global South. Having said a set of policy recommendations, both ROC and India face challenges to create new momentum to tap their inherent and complementary industrial structure and factor endowment into full swing. I expect the two leaders of India, South Korea, I believe, supposed to meet this year, and I hope two leaders demonstrate a very strong political will, which will open new era of strategic partnership between two countries. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor An. I think those are really interesting points, and particularly when you compared it with the India-Japan relationship, how many things are in order in India-Japan relationship, and particularly in the connectivity to supply chain networks, to cooperation with the ASEAN countries. And I think some of these areas could also be explored in India-Korea partnerships. And you are absolutely right. I think the supply chain initiatives, so new supply chain resilience initiatives that India, Australia, and Japan, cooperation with the US, we are talking about Korea could be a long-term and enduring partner. So your points are well taken, and also your point about ocean logistics, and this draws me to Pooja, who has written a fantastic policy brief with Brendan recently about submarine cables for our website. I'll recommend our participants to read that policy brief. But Pooja, maybe you could touch upon how India and Korea are going to collaborate on the maritime domain, particularly in the undersea cables to, with the third-party countries in the ASEAN regions. So maybe 6 to 7 minutes for you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. First of all, I would want to thank ISTP for allowing me to, present my views on this terrific panel and to, share my viewpoints here. To start with, it is always a difficult task to speak after a eloquent speaker, and as Dr. An had been very eloquent about speaking about in India-South Korea relations, I think some of the points I would take from him and take them further and very specifically in the maritime domain. But before that, I would want to address this direct question of how the Quad has been shaping, in my viewpoint, and what are the factors that is shaping it, and how Seoul sees its viewpoint and its own standing in the entire thing. So largely, if I can put them in trends, there would be three large trends in terms of how Quad has been shaping in Quad plus format. First of all the countries in the region, at least in the Indo-Pacific regions, have shifted from this inner-looking defense posture to outer-looking security architecture vision, which is no more very, specifically with their own immediate threat perception, but to a larger security perception of the region. I think that trend has been visible in a lot of countries, including South Korea and India and other countries in the region. And that has also given a lot of agencies to these regional middle powers in taking, and making in shaping and making the regional security issues and architectures. This has also led to a diversification of, within the nations to look for new like-minded partners. I think this is the larger structure within which we are now seeing Quad. And second trend that we'd be noticing about Quad is that as much as Quad has become more and more institutionalized in its framework, like we have more ministerial level meetings and high level meetings, the issues of cooperation are shifting from traditional areas of security to non-traditional areas of security. So now the Quad's new agenda, latest agenda, includes healthcare, vaccines, climate change solutions, joint development on critical and emerging technologies, resilience, supply chains. So these are all the areas where it provides an alternate and open as well as cost-effective framework for the partners to work together. Third factor that is shaping the Quad and its enlargement is this inherent debate about values versus interest as push and pull factors, right? On one side, the issues like climate change, sustainable use of oceans, science and technology cooperation, health cooperation, these are all value-based push factors, which push countries to work together for a common benefit of mankind. And that is why we all countries are, working together. But on the other hand, the issues like trade barriers, issues with technology sharing, technology, transfer of technology, commercial interest of stakeholders are all very interest-based pull factors that are also hampering the on-ground cooperation between the Indo-Pacific countries, between the Quad countries. I think taking it from what Dr. An said, like why countries are finding it very difficult, like India, South Korea are finding it very difficult to have this bilateral cooperation on ground, despite talking about all, that cooperation is good. I think these are the issues which we are facing on ground. Now, coming back to your question, Dr. Panda, that how we can find very specific areas of cooperation maritime domain, I think I will take this from the viewpoint of how to marry the deficit with potential, as Dr. An also mentioned, that India has some deficits, so as South Korea, how to marry these deficits with potential and, work towards a very workable propositions for collaboration. So first I can see is that South Korea has a lot of technology when it comes to maritime domain, whether it's port development, whether they talk about undersea cables and everything. I think South Korea has an advantage over India and other ASEAN and other countries. So On the other hand, India and ASEAN have the demographic advantage which South Korea lacks. So why not marry them together? India is ongoing with its port development project under Sagarmala, where we are looking for port modernizations to increase their capacities, to increase their workload, to go more high tech. So why not create blue education and blue jobs related to maritime domain? Why not India and South Korea can cooperate together and build projects like smart ports, which will increase productivity, do value addition to port management and development, increase employment through big data and IT. That second area of cooperation that I would seek is on the submarine cable network that Brendan and I had while writing. We actually, when we're doing this research, we found that on the ground there are a lot of differences between countries, which has to be looked into when we talk about cooperation. So in that sense, India is in very nascent state when it comes to submarine cable. Our jurisdictions, our operations, our infrastructure, all are in very nascent stage. In that sense, South Korea has a vibrant submarine cable market and has a lot to offer. In this regard, two examples come into my mind. First of all, South Korean cable and accessory manufacturer, which is Taihan, which is also a world's largest underwater telecommunication network. They have this newly acquired cable laying vessel, very new, very sophisticated, vessel, which are utilized for offshore wind power management. They can build up, they can lay pipelines to harness the wind power energy. And this can be a very useful area of cooperation between South Asia and Southeast Asia, because for Southeast East Asia, because we both are looking at clean energy. So why not, South Korea bring their technology and work with Southeast Asia and India in that regard. Second area of cooperation that I would see is with another company called KT, which is also underwater telecommunications consortium. Currently, they are doing this project, very niche project, where they're connecting the entire Southeast Asian belt: China, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. So can it be, expanded to the rest of the South Asia market as well? India is looking for that kind of network. India is building its submarine cable network and would love to have more on the ground partners for in that regard. So that is another area of cooperation. Third area of cooperation is largely from the multilateral, minilateral kind of framework, where India, ASEAN, and South Korea can come together to develop a marine governance framework in the Indo-Pacific region. We understand there is no high seas management framework at the moment. We are far away from joining the High Seas Treaty, which is ABNJ Treaty. So what is the solution in the meanwhile? Because even if ABNJ comes into existence and we can establish marine protected areas, just like any other international organization, it would not have teeth to implement its its laws and mechanisms. So in this regard, I was hoping that another area of cooperation would be developing an alternate framework within the Quad between these countries to build up, to support and supplement these kind of organizations with their law enforcement agencies. Can that be worked together? Why I think it is a possibility, because India, South Korea, and other countries are already having this Coast Guard management, mechanisms in existence. So why can these already existing maritime law enforcement agencies can work together to leverage a rules-based maritime order in the Indo-Pacific? So that would be my third area of cooperation. But there has to be I also want to go through issues that are on the ground that also need to be focused, which can be a deal breaker in this kind of cooperation. And I think I'm being devil's advocate in that case, but it's also necessary to mention that, first of all, whatever areas of cooperation we are talking about right now, whether technology and manufacturing and communication, they're all very MNCs and conglomerates held in, they are all businessmen. They would seek profit out of this business. So the Quad, while maintaining this delicate balance in terms of, bringing cooperation between them and also ensuring that these MNCs and conglomerates get their benefit out of the cooperation, Quad has to play a very delicate balance in terms of building up the framework of cooperation and also maintaining what kind of market competition can there be, because market competition has to be in the free market. So I'm not very sure how Quad is very going to manage that kind of issue. Second thing is that I see as a problem, which might be a problem in this cooperation, is building this kind of bipartisan political support for Quad. Because what is happening right now, the current government from all in India and South Korea are having this kind of political support for Quad and people support for the Quad. But in case there is a government in any of the countries, Quad countries, and there are supporting countries where they do not find that kind of support for Quad within their own political jurisdiction and domestic support, I think Quad might take a hit on that regard. So how to build a bipartisan support within the domestic constituencies and another area where Quad needs to work. And third is how to build a Quad governance for global commons. And I think this is my personal area of interest, because Quad is now emerging to be, trying to govern areas which are currently under global commons, which are basically ungoverned spaces with public goods. How would Quad help to work together in terms of avoiding overexploitation of these resources, promoting sustainable use of these resources? I think these are the issues of cooperation which need to be thought deeply before we can, start working together on the cooperation level. So to end with this, I would say I'm glad that Quad has shifted its focus from form to function, where their focus is more on functioning together than overt obsession with how Quad should look like. And I think this will be very beneficial for India and South Korea and other countries who want to be a part of Quad, bring their expertise, bring their potential within the Quad, and solve the major problems that the Indo-Pacific countries are facing on a common interest basis rather than a common threat basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are excellent points. In fact, I do agree with your first interesting point, which is value-based issues to interest-based issues, and then about port modernization, which we are already doing with Koreans, coastal development plans, and blue educations. These are actually emerging areas which we should be focusing on. Without any delay, let me bring Brendan here, and let me also share for all of our participants and read, those who are listening this conversation, the policy brief they wrote recently for ISDP website. You could download it in our chat box or in the ISDP website. It has emerged out to be one of those popular policy briefs in recent times. So maybe Brendan, you are having some more points to add to the conversation today. Over to you.
Thanks, Jagannath. Thanks, ISDP, for hosting this excellent discussion today. I'm going to play devil's advocate like Pooja did a little bit, and Professor Ahn also aired. Look, there's challenges and there's opportunities that need to be weighed in this ROK and India convergence, if you will. But I'm going to take my comments up a level, looking at the Quad and the international structure and some of the impediments that may hamper this cooperation. Not only between India and South Korea, but also between the Quad and the ROK. So there's this fundamental conundrum that the Quad itself faces, which is Asia-Pacific versus Indo-Pacific. This divide hasn't been bridged yet. India's concerns in the Pacific world are obviously secondary to its concerns in the Indian South Asia world. But South Korea's and Japan's concerns are firmly Asia-Pacific, all right? And so the 0 hour, or the Germans call Stunde Null, is going to begin for them in East Asia. And this has really important implications for what we're seeing in terms of great power competition in general. We know from IR scholarship and history that balancing coalitions or alliances only form generally after the advent of conflict. Now, that is the good news I think we're seeing here over the past 10 years, even 15, for India, South Korea, Japan, the US, and the bad news for China really is that these countries are already taking steps to bridge these divides. It's hard to remember back in 2007 when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came up with the idea of the Quad, that this was not some group that was a fait accompli. Instead, it was a really distant possibility that India would join this Indo-Pacific world and work with Japan, first of all, on security-related matters, let alone even further afield, the United States. And so that turns, then the question becomes, why are they doing this? The short answer is China, but there's probably greater explanatory variables, I think, than India's, Japan's, and the ROK's distinct concerns about China. I tend to look at classical geopolitics to explain this convergence, if you will. So Mackinder and Spikeman and people who were writing 100 years ago, this arc of cooperation and security convergence from the UK all the way around through India and on up through South Korea on the fringes of Eurasia is explained really well with classical geopolitics, in that these states in general are going to converge in terms of security-related interests with a rising potential hegemon in Eurasia. And we've got this very clearly with China. Now, in terms of the Quad versus the Quint, bringing South Korea into the Quad, I actually think this is a non-starter. I'm being purposely provocative here, so you can ask me questions about this. But the current club is powerful in that it maintains a highly informal and workable format where its 4 members can discuss their common concerns about security. They can host summits easily, and they can issue joint statements that have a high degree of signaling power to both the Quad capitals and to Beijing. I think as the BRICS is unhappily finding out, and this is where Pooja's comments on form versus function are really critical, the BRICS are really concerned about form. And they're finding out that adding more partners formally, even to an informal organization, can make their format extremely unwieldy at best and outright unworkable at worst. So why won't the Quad expand to include South Korea? I think it's simply for the same reasons or some similar reasons why AUKUS won't become JAUKUS and add Japan. The Quad works as it is and continues to gain traction without having to deal with the noise that would come from more partners. I'm not saying South Korea wouldn't play a critical role here, but there's some reasons I'll get into very quickly. I know my comments I need to close my comments soon. But the Quad Plus format, on the other hand, also has problems. It's juddered and stalled, not because it's unimportant, but because the meaning is often not the same for these nascent Quad Plus partners who are quite distinct from one another, whether it's New Zealand, South Korea, Vietnam, etc. The Quad Plus format seeks to remove the sticking power of China as its glue. Instead, it looks at connectivity, security of supply, etc., which the Quad does as well. And these are very laudable goals, and I'm not saying they shouldn't happen. But the salience and importance attached to these initiatives by a diversity of actors may see actually more cheap riding or free riding rather than the heavy lifting that we need to confront these omnipresent and existential security concerns in East Asia and in the Indo-Pacific in general, excuse me. I will say that of all the states that could be added to the Quad, South Korea is by far the best choice. It does share consistent and existential concerns about China. It does have strategic geography. It brings some heavy lifting power in terms of its national power index and capabilities, okay? But South Korea's domestic political scene does militate against this in terms of both consistency as how it faces the China threat, as compared to that posed by North Korea and Russia. And of course, it's South Korea's necessary, absolutely necessary laser focus on North Korea that actually inhibits it a little bit from becoming a full partner of the Quad as well. So I'll leave my comments there, and thank you very much. Look forward to some questions.
Thank you, Brendan. I think those are excellent points, and I do agree with you, even though the concept Indo-Pacific has been legitimized in many countries and in many forms, but still Asia-Pacific, it draws a lot of traction, and I completely agree with you. And I do understand the problems you are talking about in the Quad Plus framework, and this problem is not going to fade away. There will be questions raised about the Quad Plus format because there is no official mechanisms or structural mechanisms attached to it. But while saying that, I do agree also with your point, and this is what we have been writing, that if any country fits into the Quad Plus format as a natural partner, that is South Korea. And you are right, if Japan comes there with the AUKUS as a JAUKUS, or at some point we are talking about expanding the Five Eyes formulations, which involves Canada, then we could rightfully thinking about at some stage expanding the networks or the horizons of Quad itself, where South Korea can come and few others can come in the plus format. But with that note, let me invite Mahima as the next speaker. Mahima has been writing about Quad and about Indo-Pacific. She has also published with me on the Quad Plus issues. Mahima, I would leave the floor to you to raise few questions, your thoughts, basically how India and South Korea you think could collaborate in the field of newly arriving challenging issues. For example, science and technology or critical technologies, cyberspace, and also on the resilience infrastructure, connectivity. You have been writing on these issues. So how do you think, what are the critical areas could be the main medium of collaboration? And do you think these collaborations could really lead to a realistic, credible platform or South Korea's engagement with the Quad countries, and how that is going to be beneficial for South Korea-India relation? Over to you, Mahima.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. First of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you to both you and ISTP. And that's, I think, a long list of prescriptions to discuss. So I will try to, address them all, but keep my remarks brief. Just to begin, I think I would like to echo Dr. Cannon's very valid remarks on why a Quad plus South Korea kind of framework is a non-starter. I quite agree with him. If you just look at how the Quad has evolved, it has been a very long, very arduous process from the first iteration of the Quad, which came about after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. It very quickly dissipated because there wasn't enough to hold these four countries together. And the process of building that mutual trust, to building that synergy between these countries and to reaching a point where regular interaction between them, including an annual leaders summit and several issues-based working groups, it has been a long process, and it is finally at a point that it can have very practical cooperation in the region. But I would say the Quad is operationalized, but it is not yet institutionalized in the region. And it is still a nascent grouping. It has no standing secretariat or central body or formal charter. And it is based, I think, entirely on the solid bilateral relationships between these partners. And of course, an increasing alignment on strategic issues, which has given way to quadrilateral cooperation between them. So South Korea is still a recent addition to the Indo-Pacific conceptualization, and it is too early to be discussing any formal expansion of the Quad, even if it becomes possible maybe years down the lane, although that is difficult to predict. And again, I'm not very optimistic about that. But at this point, South Korea's formal full-fledged membership into the Quad would actually serve to dilute the Quad's effectiveness in what is perhaps its central purpose, in that is balancing China, while also not appearing to be overtly anti-China. And the flexibility that this Quad grouping has is extremely important to this purpose. So I think it's no surprise that there is very little interest among the Quad member states to consider an expansion. But what we can realistically discuss, I mean, even considering the structural issues that come with a Quad Plus and the differences in how a Quad Plus is interpreted by various countries, what we can realistically discuss is expanding functional cooperation of the Quad with countries in the region. Maybe through an adaptive engagement that sort of suits the current flexible structure that the Quad has. I would maybe disagree a little bit with what Dr. Bhatt said, and I would say that the Quad is more or less here to stay. I find that in most member countries, there is quite a bit of support on both sides of the aisle and across administrations. And even with the changes in administrations that the Quad has seen, so for instance, in the US, it has persisted. And I think it is likely that it will continue to be a fixture in the Indo-Pacific institutional architecture, although the effect it will have remains to be seen. Already, we have seen it expand the range of issues it works on, as Dr. Bhatt pointed out, and include economic and non-traditional security matters within its portfolio. And South Korea could very well be a part of some of its subsidiary programs and working groups. So what I'm basically proposing is parallel engagements via bilateral consultations, and this is probably the most accessible option. And this can be complemented by issue-specific coordination and cooperation with the Quad for South Korea. Let me highlight three or so areas. First of all, I think South Korea and Quad share concerns regarding climate change, and this is probably one of the most important areas where there is a lot of potential for them to cooperate more closely on things like climate-focused infrastructure facilitation, as well as green shipping and hydrogen. South Korea's Indo-Pacific policy is essentially based on three pillars: inclusiveness, trust, and reciprocity. And this, I think, lends itself really well to the Quad's work on quality and resilient infrastructure development and digital connectivity. So I think this is one area where the Quad also requires broader cooperation to meet the very, very high demand for high standards infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific, infrastructure that is quality, that is transparent, that is sustainable, economically efficient, and also addresses things like job creation and capacity building. South Korea is already engaged in economic cooperation and broad projects in the region on a bilateral basis. Professor Ahn talked about this a little bit. These bilateral dialogues could lead on to Seoul's participation in Quad projects, like providing technical assistance and capacity building to regional states without imposing unsustainable debt burdens. As I said, infrastructure is one area where broad cooperation is essential. Even with the Quad countries working together, it is not enough to counter or to balance the impact that China has in the region. So working with more countries, more like-minded partners like South Korea, and perhaps even other middle power partners, extra-regional partners like the EU, would be beneficial. Just to bring focus back to India and South Korea, bilaterally, they are already collaborating on establishing some 28 hydrogen smart cities. So we talked about, port infrastructure development and port development projects. But in addition to this, I think it's important to consider South Korea's expertise. It has already established some 10 hydrogen smart cities in the country, and it is now looking to export this expertise, which I think could be very beneficial for India as well as other countries in the region. Last year, various concerned agencies and private enterprises of both countries came together to discuss future collaborations, and the director of KIEP, Dr. Cho, proposed a green hydrogen smart city pilot project, and this could shape the new era in India-Korea bilateral relations for the next 50 years. 2 Indian states have already signed on to this. They've already signed formal agreements, that's Sikkim and Rajasthan. And there are 3 more states who are discussing more and who are on the cusp of signing final agreements. That is Maharashtra, Jammu and Kashmir, and Uttar Pradesh, I believe. So these sorts of mega projects have several benefits. Not only will they attract more Korean investments and greater presence of Korean small, medium, and micro enterprises in India, And of course, they will strengthen their bilateral economic relationships, but they also open the door to third country cooperation between South Korea and India, and could easily be co-opted as larger Quad-related projects. India and South Korea are discussing joint projects in countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, and this could be one area where such projects could actualize. Of course, these talks are still in early stages, but I do recognize that there is a lot of scope to coordinate these efforts, these bilateral efforts, with those of the Quad. Also, these projects open the door for new collaborations on futuristic industries and critical technologies. And I think this marks another area where South Korean cooperation with the Quad could be essential. So South Korea is a global technological leader. I think we all recognize that. And it has a great deal to contribute to the Quad, but also gain from cooperation with the Quad. Recently, US and Korea, they launched a trilateral with India to focus on next generation critical and emerging technologies. And they will be holding their first National Security Council-led consultations on the topic in the first quarter of 2024. I think it's upcoming soon. And this trilateral highlights various areas like artificial intelligence, batteries, clean energy, biotechnology, biomanufacturing, of course, semiconductors, but also things like digital connectivity. And many of these overlap with the Quad. So while there are, of course, challenges in their cooperation in terms of the strategic differences, perhaps the inconsistent technological policies that these countries have, and even sometimes lacking policy structures. Just initiating this separate trilateral dialogue, I think, is a great way to build up cooperation, and it can act as a building block for greater collaboration with the Quad. There are several projects within this critical technology focus where Korea would be a valuable, I would argue even essential partner. And one thing I wanted to highlight is, compared to developers from China, US, even European states, Samsung is recognized as the partner of choice for ASEAN countries when it comes to 5G infrastructure. So the Quad CET group, it focuses on building open, transparent, and efficient 5G network architectures, and working with South Korea and working with South Korean industries, I think, could be vital in this regard. Similarly, on digital governance structures and on the Quad STEM program, it is worthy to think about increasing cooperation with South Korea. I mean, for example, it could lead on to greater collaborations in science, technology, and of course, the entire domain. Lastly, just to sort of round off my remarks, I also wanted to point out that, South Korean views of the Quad are shaped by the view of its security environment, which is, its somewhat negative opinions of China and its desire for greater alliance solidarity with the US. But moving forward, we must consider what happens if we enter into another Trump presidency in 2024. I mean, I was just reading an article in the New York Times today about how the Republican wing is all about Donald Trump first, and how they are already blocking some of the aid packages to Taiwan, which are, a bill which is pending in the Senate. So just thinking about, potentially different direction that US foreign policy could go in. It is important to strengthen middle power partnerships, and it is important for these like-minded middle powers to work together to reach out to the smaller countries in the region. And in this regard, I think talking about greater India-South Korea cooperation, even by way of the Quad, is extremely important.
Thank you, Mahima. Those are useful remarks. In fact, I'll just flag out 2 points that you mentioned in your speech. One is Quad has become operationalized but not institutionalized. Well, I would agree with you, and we have written about it. So absolutely right. That's right. But probably the officials, when from each of the Quad countries, when they listen to us, they might not really agree with us. And I think Brendan has also written a fantastic article in International Affairs on this issue, possibly about formalization and informalization of the Quad process. But I think one of the key points is that the way Quad is actually proceeding ahead, there is definitely a legal official sanctity involved in it. It might not have a headquarter, but yes, it is getting increasingly institutionalized. The second point is that you mentioned about the South Korea's views about the Quad, which is China-centric, and of course, it is based on the US framework alliance partnerships. That's absolutely right. But the two other issues, which also is shaping South Korea's views towards perspective towards Quad, is the ASEAN mode of politics. If you see, you know that for a fact that in ASEAN region, Japan is the most important investor, economic actor there. So China comes as the second influential economic actor. Now, there are competition between US, EU, and South Korea, who could take that third, fourth, and fifth spot in terms of investment. So I think ASEAN region is one aspect that is actually shaping South Korea's perception towards views towards Quad. The other factor is also, it's not really the most important factor, but this is a constant factor and we cannot rule out, is the North Korean issue. If you see in the Quad statement, there has been mentioned about North Korea's nuclear test and also about the Korean Peninsula. And that's definitely, there is a South Korean angle attached to it, because this mention has only happened after South Korea has been invited to participate in the Quad Plus meeting during the pandemic and post the pandemic. So I think these are the two other factors I thought I'll flag it out here. But with this note, let me invite Stephen to sum up the discussion today in terms of sharing his own view. He's based in Japan. Japan is the most critical and the profounder of Quad framework in many sense, and also he's from a neutral country that is from Canada and spent time in China. So I think he is the right person to see more from a neutral point of view whether there is realistically a kind of realistically it's possible for the India and South Korea to collaborate within that Quad Plus framework or not. But with this, let me also encourage all our participants, if you have any questions, please drop your questions in Q&A. So after Stephen finishes his views, then we'll read the Q&A, and then we would ask each of the panelists to respond to those questions. Stephen, in order to proceed for the discussion, I would request you to keep it short and sum up and share your views maybe in 5 minutes or so.
Yes, I can do that. Thank you very much to ISDP and to you, Jagannath, for organizing this conference. I just, rather than giving you a few notes, I think I'd like to raise some questions, because I think the questions are informed by most of the comments of the speakers here today. And I guess the first question is what does the Quad mean for different countries? And this was touched upon, but when you're in Tokyo or Canberra, or you're in Washington or Delhi, there are very different views of what the Quad is, and we've seen the Quad evolve accordingly. And this suggests that they're not harmonized on many activities, especially on the security front, and they may be a better place to deal with public good provision. Yet, and this is related to my second question, what are actually the concrete deliverables that the Quad has delivered so far? And this is a very difficult question. We've talked about this initiative and that initiative, but what is actually the concrete deliverable that has been repeated and sustained? And this is a big question, and I don't think we've had really the track record yet to suggest that the Quad is something that we can rely upon yet. So again, what are the concrete actions and outcomes of the Quad to date? And based on those concrete outcomes and initiatives, where could possibly South Korea fit in? in a plug-in fashion or add value? And I think that's a very, very important question for us. Third, we have seen the Quad evolve. It's evolved towards public good provision over the past 4 or 5 years. This has been largely, I think, by the influence of ASEAN and ASEAN's concerns about the Quad becoming a security-oriented initiative. But I think we should be frank, India's position has also pushed the Quad in that direction. And this is not exactly aligned with the priorities, I think, of Tokyo or Canberra or Washington. So this is a challenge in terms of thinking about where the Quad moves forward and which partners do we plug into in an ad hoc way. So again, I think that the direction of the Quad will be primarily defined by the direction of China. If China becomes more assertive in the region, if China does press its interests across the Taiwan Straits, if China becomes more belligerent towards the Philippines, we may see the Quad raison d'etre expand. But at this particular stage, we don't really see India expanding its security presence into the South China Sea or the East China Sea, which are, again, Japan's priorities. So I think that this is really important for us to be thinking about. In that sense, when I think about the Quad and South Korea's participation alongside India, I think that we should think about, again, functional plug-in cooperation. Brendan, Pooja, Mahama, and Professor An has mentioned different areas of cooperation, whether it's maritime security or supply chains or the digital economy. These are all potential areas that South Korea could potentially plug in into concrete initiatives. But this goes back to my second question, or what is the concrete outcomes of the Quad to date? And this is a challenge. I think another point with regards to the actual places for South Korea to plug in is there a more regional focus? Can South Korea perhaps add value to the Quad's maritime domain awareness activities in the Sea of Japan, perhaps in the Pacific Islands, perhaps in the South China Sea, but leave other activities in the West and Indian Ocean to a different formula of plug-in? So I think a regional approach may be able to help focus South Korea's assets to be more complementary with the current Quad members. And I think this is actually an approach that may get buy-in. I'm not so sure the Japanese really are hoping for South Korea and India in the ocean, but they may be very willing to have more South Korean participation on dealing with North Korea. But in terms of public good provision, here is where I think South Korea can plug in and add more value. And again, I think it was Pooja that mentioned this in terms of resilient supply chain initiatives, the environment. I even think that there's space for Pacific Island policies where the Quad countries can concentrate their resources to deal with some of the environmental challenges that are existential for these countries. Lastly, and I would like to just touch upon this idea of the divergences in the Quad members. And I guess this is my biggest concern for the sustainability of South Korean involvement within the Quad. And we've seen this when we transition from the Moon administration to the Yoon administration. We see a South Korea that is globally engaged, that is still concerned about the challenges with regards to Japan, but they've made the mature decision to push this behind closed doors, let the diplomats deal with it, and find platforms for cooperation. Is the Yoon administration sustainable? I'm not so sure. The Modi administration as well, I think it's sustainable, but the current direction of India is, well, frankly, less liberal than I think the other Quad members would like. It is less committed to issues of rule of law. And I think its position on Russia has challenged how we think about India. Frankly, I think Hindu nationalism will create more challenges for how we balance our national interests and how to work with India. Susceptibility to economic coercion, South Korea is very vulnerable. Boosting cooperation within the Quad on an ad hoc basis may put South Korea in a very vulnerable position at the economic level. And I think Professor An can speak to this, where India, not as developed, not as integrated with the Chinese economy, and not as susceptible to economic coercion, meaning India and South Korea are starting from a different place as they think about the participating in the Quad. And lastly, and I guess this goes back to my point about broader participation in global public good exercises, what is the geographic scope of cooperation? Should we spread the peanut butter too thin, or should we concentrate on where we think we can add value? And I think we can add value for South Korea on maritime domain awareness activities, perhaps on consolidating sea lines of communication in the eastern part of the Indo-Pacific, and the other Quad members may be better suited to work with, for example, with the EU or particular EU members to deal with the Western Indian Oceans and issues like we're seeing in the Red Sea. So just to sum up, I think we have questions about the Quad members and their different understandings of the Quad. I think we need to think about what are the concrete initiatives the Quad has actually completed. I think we really need to take a look at how China will affect the Quad's development. And then lastly, I think the domestic politics in both India and South Korea may affect the ability to participate in a sustained and meaningful way. Thanks for the great opportunity.
Thank you, Stephen. I do agree with you. Those are fantastic points. I think the divergences within the Quad would be the biggest hindrance. I think to talk about a framework building between South Korea and Quad within the Quad Plus framework. And I think you are right. I think Yoon administration's foreign policy might look really aggressive, nationalist, and Indo-Pacific centric at this moment, but whether it is going to be sustainable in South Korea, we have seen South Korea's foreign policy changing with the political parties coming to power, what kind of parties are coming to power and what kind of groupings are being inducted into the government. So one has to really hold doubt there. In fact, Professor An would be the right person to comment about it. The second is the geographic focus that you pointed out, and I do completely agree with you that still among the Quad countries, the core 4 countries, India, US, Japan, and Australia, still there is no agreement per se about the geographical focus about how the Quad has to really maneuver and proceed further. There are contested areas, and each of their definitional viewpoints about Indo-Pacific differs. So when we talk about the operational aspects of the Quad, building up about providing a security on the Taiwan issue, let's say about South China Sea issues, whether all the Quad countries really agree, and forget about Quad Plus countries. So I think one of the gray areas is that geographical focus, but then that also comes as an additional plus point that if the Quad countries are really constrained by the geographies, then the plus countries also comes as a partners to build that consensus. So I think that's the whole purpose behind the Quad Plus framework. We have seen it in becoming successful during the pandemic. But after the pandemic, probably it has not really been publicized much. So we don't know whether these plus meetings has happened or not. But definitely there are some merits. Equally, there are some challenging aspects. With this note, let me invite all of you to draw your attention to the Q&A box. Probably I would not be liking to read all of these comments line by line in order to save time. But I would encourage each one of you to read some of these questions and comment on this. I think I got a message from Mahima. She might have to leave probably 5 minutes before we wind up because of some other urgent commitment. But so I will invite you, Mahima, to first comment on this, and then I'll go in the reverse order. First Stephen, then then Brendan, then Pooja, then Professor An. So there is a comment, extensive comment from Captain Paramar from New Delhi, Sarabjit S. Paramar. So maybe you could read the comment here. And there are subsequent also comments from other participants. Maybe you could comment. There is a comment about, about India-South Korea collaborations. But what do you think about Kashmir and line of control? Actually, that is a interesting point to discuss, whether South Korea would be really can take a position, because as Professor An rightly pointed out, that between India and Japan, there is a special chemistry has been built. In fact, Japanese ambassador in Delhi has been quite categorical to support India on the boundary issues, boundary conflicts with China. And he has supported India like anything. And in fact, I remember when the Chumar incident happened in 2014, and the Galwan incident happened in 2019-20, and the Ladakh incident happened the Galwan incident happened, that time also the Japanese ambassador has been quite categorical in extending the support to India and saying that how authoritarian powers are actually changing the status quo. So whether South Korea would be in a position to actually extend this kind of diplomatic or political support to India and on conflicting issues relates to India and China. And there are other comments. Maybe you could read some of these comments and comment. So over to you first, Mahima, and then I'll come in the reverse order.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Just to begin with, I think one comment I had was Dr. Nagy made a very, very interesting point about, how can we measure the Quad's impact? I think that's very important to consider and ponder more. Since the Quad 2.0 has been established and the working groups have come into play, after 1 year, I think there was one statement which kind of outlined the impact these working groups had, but this was limited to, say, the vaccines that they provided in the region. And even then, the numbers were a bit suspect. Yeah, we're not sure whether they were delivered, whether the last mile delivery happened as stated. But I think it is interesting to consider this more as we talk about functional cooperation. We go by the agendas that these groups have set, but whether these agendas translate into practical projects remains to be seen, and updates regarding this will be very valuable moving forward. I will go to the Q&A now, and I'll just address Dr. Parmar's comment. Thank you for joining us today, sir. And yes, I understand what you mean by, instead of having a Quad plus structure, it might be more useful to have minilaterals and trilaterals. Just to lay out my thoughts, I think one thing we always need to keep in mind is that, trilateral, minilateral cooperation is all about functionality. The flexibility is what is crucial to ensuring that it can move fast, it can be effective, without the cumbersome issues that, multilateral cooperation always comes with. So there are, I would say, maybe 4 levels of cooperation I would envision. So one is at the bilateral, which I discussed briefly. So, bilateral consultations, coordination, and cooperation. And this can be expanded to, I won't say trilateral, but I would say maybe a sub-Quad minilateral, like the India-US, South Korea trilateral, which has just cropped up, or the India-Australia-France trilateral. These sort of groupings can be very effective in certain issue areas. And of course, one is the Quad, and moving beyond the Quad is a more formal Quad plus format, which involves a third country alongside these alongside all the Quad countries. So I think it needs to be more issues based. Every issue area that these countries are working on calls for a different level of participation, and a different involvement of actors based on their strengths and what they can bring to the table. So we need to be thinking in those terms and making sure that this ad hoc form of cooperation is adaptive and flexible. And I will, just in the interest of time, I think I will stop there, and over to you, sir.
So thank you. No, those are useful comments, Mahima. I do agree with you. Stephen, you have to, do you have anything to share with Captain Parmar's
Sure, I just want to address Dr. Parmar's question. And I think, moving forward, I think the Quad and expanding the Quad is probably not the right approach to thinking about how we should expand cooperation. I think we should realize the heterogeneous nature of the Quad members. Heterogeneous in terms of interest, heterogeneous in terms of priorities, heterogeneous in terms of how they understand the organization. And with that, we may want to take or may want to look at thinking about the Quad in terms of the IPEF formulation, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, in which it's an a la carte approach to which activities you participate in. You become an IPEF member or a Quad member, but you choose the areas of cooperation that you feel most comfortable in. So the current Quad members, they may be all on the same book in terms of, for example, resilient supply chain initiatives, but they're probably not on the same page of the book in terms of the geographic scope of where the maritime domain awareness activities should be involved in. So I think a more flexible approach to thinking about the Quad may be the kind of way that we can expand ad hoc participation on specific activities. So again, reformulating it as not as we do everything together all the time, but rather this a la carte approach to which activities that we need to be. But the core members are these 4 countries, which have, I guess, the most substantial resources that they can apply to the region. On Dean Richards' question with regards to Taiwan, this is an interesting question, and I think that we often...
So Stephen, we'll come back to on Taiwan and other issues a little while later. Maybe first we'll take one round and then I'll come back to you. Brendan?
Hi, yeah, so as far as deliverables of the Quad, you know, I think very quickly there's 3 Ds. There's 2 Ds: deterrence and détente, as well as psychological self-help. And we can quibble about, okay, is this really deterrence? Is this really détente? Well, no, but because the Quad is precisely a security grouping, and this is going to Captain Agnihotri's question here, it is a security grouping, but it lives by the adage of speak softly and carry a big stick, okay, to use President Teddy Roosevelt's old statement. And so to riff on Foreign Minister Jai Shankar's comment from a few years back about we need to be for something, well, the Quad being about security and against Chinese hegemonism or hegemonic actions is also for the security, stability, sovereignty, and territoriality of its members. And so while this is by no means an alliance, we should never refer to it as such, this is not an Asian NATO or anything approaching that, it does pay massive dividends for its members, even if we're not quite to the area where we can agree about what to do about Taiwan, for example. That's my answer to the question.
Thank you. Pooja?
Yes, I largely agree with everyone about the Quad perspective, and but I would like to add an angle to it that, you know, and how I mentioned that Quad is now, you know, giving more priority to its function than its form. I think what Quad is right now trying to do, and it's just my personal opinion about it, is setting the larger framework of cooperation between the countries on various issues. Now it's no more a security, defense-based, you know, cooperation, which initially it thought to be. It has now shifted to a very broad-based security organization, where the ideas of security involves human security, such as when it brings to, you know, vaccines and other issues into picture. So I think what has happened is now the Quad is setting up this larger narrative about how the entire issues of security now needs to be seen. And within that framework, I agree with other scholars that within those you know, larger areas of cooperation, countries can pick up which trilateral or multilateral format they want to adopt to, and which gives a lot of flexibility in terms of cooperation. You have a larger area where you know, all the countries think alike on various issues, and then on certain areas you have the capability, other had the deficit, you talk about it, you form your minilateral based on what you want. I think that is a larger idea from which viewpoint I would see Quad moving into in the form of, you know, in its current form. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor An?
Yeah. Okay, you know, I have really the intriguing question on what's the prime purpose of the Quad. The way I understand it, the Quad was conceived against China's the Belt Road Initiative and China's you know, containing the illegal territorial claim in South China Sea, and even interfering of fundamental rule of law on the freedom of navigation. Okay, on that ground, I think this original court members, got together how to prevent China's the expansionism in violating the international rule of law. That was my, the understanding. The other issues, all the maritime, public goods issues is just sort of the camouflaging the original intention of the Quad purpose. Maritime, public goods like climate change and green industry, cyber terrorism, SME development, port logistic development, all these issues are discussed, very intensively, written very specifically in, if you look at every chapter of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, as well as even the APEC, although APEC agreement is non-binding. By the way, this RCEP and APEC, China, is active participant in this program. So if you look at the every chapter of this RCEP agreement, by the way, India opted out, and but also APEC, I participated APEC as Economic Committee Chair. We have been addressing all the time, the kind of issues we're talking about. All the Quad members must address the climate change and cyber terrorism, etc., etc. So in that score, how we can distinguish, the Quad attempt addressing the public goods issues and also the RCEP and the APEX, purpose. So if you say that, hey, Quad has rather smaller number of nations, therefore it might be more effective to carry out a specific functional test. Okay, maybe I might agree, but I think this, we need to distinguish what is the ultimate and the prime purpose of the Quad. Okay, and if we start to mix with other public goods, I mean, it's very hard to distinguish. Okay, what's the Quad and RCEP, Regional Company Economic Partnership, and APEC, even for them matter, CPTPP. As far as Korea's position is concerned, South Korea do not want to decouple China completely, from its own built-in the economic engagement. And China also exercised most powerful leverage on North Korea. So we don't want to antagonize China. Okay, as the way the Quad members addressing all these issues. Well, on even the security dimension, which Quad members are addressing, say, for example, South Korea established the nuclear consultation, the meeting with the United States. I think this for the first time, September last year. So we have very strong protection with the U.S. And then we restored the South Korea, Japan, U.S. Intelligence gathering and the GSOMIA, so forth. So we have very strong bondage on the security relations issues. We also developed already very good security relationship with Australia. In fact, South Korea succeeded in selling out big chunk of this new arms to Australia. We can see there's some very strong security bondage right there. And now, we are talking about this arms collaboration with India. So what I'm saying is that South Korea has very good security relationship with the Quad members. Therefore, I think this, South Korea would be, delighted to participate any public goods issues. In fact, for that purpose, I think that Quad members should be even ready to open the admission of China. If you talk to Chinese, they're talking all the time these great, public goods, anti-terrorism and cyber security, and also the air pollution, marine pollution, so forth. They think that therefore China say that, hey, RCEP agreement must be strengthened, must be respected by all the RCEP members. So
Thank you, Professor An. And I think those are useful remarks. There are already few pressing questions. We don't have time, so I would be extending the time to 5 to 7 minutes and invite each of the speakers to comment in 1.5 minutes each. Maybe I'll start with Stephen on Taiwan, then on India, Japan, South Korea. Simran has asked these questions on the trilateral. What do you think about that? And also about the ASEAN, ARF, and ADMMM plus, including on the Taiwan questions, if you could comment, Stephen. Maybe 2 minutes or so.
I will be very brief. Thank you very much. With regards to Taiwan, I think we should be very clear, whether it's India, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's Japan, or whether it's South Korea, Taiwan plays a major part of the region's economy. In Southeast Asia and in India, it's a big supplier of FDI. And as a result, I just don't think India or Southeast Asia can stick their head in the sand and not have a position if there was some kind of conflict across the Taiwan Strait. They have economic interests, and I want to link this back to Professor An's points at the very start, that this region is economically integrated and that economic interests are shared. And as a result, these shared interests are the framework for how they should focus on cooperation. On the Simran's questions, does India, Japan, South Korea trilateral have the potential coming soon? At this stage, no. I think what we should be looking for is India, ASEAN, Japan cooperation, and that may be a platform for future cooperation. It seems that Japan and India are trying to strengthen cooperation through ASEAN and start to bring a connection with ASEAN centrality as the connector between Japan and India to bring together developing countries with a developed country to advocate for public good provision, development, infrastructure connectivity, and security cooperation in the area of research and search and rescue, humanitarian disasters, disaster assistance relief, as well as environmental issues. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, everyone. I need to run to a meeting.
Thank you, Stephen, for joining. So quickly, we have just 2 minutes. Maybe Pooja, Brendan, and then Professor An, last words. Pooja, anything?
On the arms issue of how South Korea can help, of course, understanding the China equation and South Korea, and also seeing that how India, China, the front line is going from arms to back to the sticks and stones kind of story. So I don't think we are looking at the arms at the moment, but I think more of a high-tech surveillance systems and other war-fighting infrastructure which can give Indian Army an equal footing of war fighting when it comes to very extreme temperatures. I think that's where Korean technologies can come into the collaboration. And yes, ASEAN is again on the ASEAN issue. The thing is, because ASEAN's own divergent issues on China, it's quite difficult to bring certain kind of collaboration. But yes, when it comes to maritime domain awareness and issues such as that, I think we have very, very practical areas to cooperate.
Right, I do agree with you, Pooja. Interesting point. Over to you, Brendan, briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Jagannath, and thanks, everyone. A fantastic panel. Look, yeah, just to riff on the ASEAN thing, I've got an article that should be published any day in Global Policy on competing informalities between ASEAN and the Quad, and this speaks directly to Alejandro Reyes' question about ASEAN and our lack of mention of it. This is going to become increasingly an issue in this Indo-Pacific world we're dealing with states in ASEAN wanting different things and having an unclear picture of their own security interests. I'm not saying the Philippines falls into this. It's a little bit of an outlier, but that's an interesting ending to all of this. And then just underscore, I think these trilateral configurations and bilateral configurations are absolutely essential to the health of the Quad. And I think that this ROK, India, US trilateral is something that should really be pursued. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brendan. So Professor An, just 30 seconds. Any last word from you?
Yes, I think in this hour, Jagan, I would like to see that we focus more on the collaboration, how we can do it between India and Korea on a bilateral context. Okay, if we start to expand it to view in a regional context like the Quad or things are very complicated, and therefore we would like to recommend a very specific, policy on a bilateral context, and maybe bringing some, unilateral implications, as mentioned that the South Korea, ASEAN, and the India, collaboration or something like that. Okay.
I do agree with you, Professor Anna, and thank you very much for those final thoughts to all of you. And I'm happy to have this excellent panel. Thanks, Pooja. Thanks, Mahima. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Brendan and Professor Han for joining, and all those participants who have joined for this interesting discussion. I have learned a lot. And I'll also take this opportunity to thank my colleagues in ISDP, Ms. Anna Jarmuth, the outreach coordinator, who has actually worked in the background to help set up for everything for us so nicely. Also, I'll be thanking my colleagues, Georgia and Anna in the Indo-Pacific Center, who has been in the background listening and helping us with the logistics. And I'll also encourage all the participants to stay tuned for ISDP's future events and publications. Look at our website for the future events, join, and also subscribe our newsletters and publications. We have a lot of activities and publications coming out, so you are free to surf the ISDP website to get the latest information. But with this note, let me thank all the panelists again for your wonderful insights, thoughts today, and this has been a very useful interaction. Have a good day, good week ahead, and we'll meet very soon, probably very soon. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.